Sometimes hatred eats deeper than disease. Sometimes cruelty becomes the loudest voice in a room. But on one quiet American night, a man who carried both pride and poison in his heart came face to face with the one truth he never expected. The person he mocked could become the person he depended on to live. Welcome to Black Community Stories. Make sure you like and subscribe for your top-notch stories. The racist veteran who was saved by the woman he mocked. The summer air was heavy in Alabama that night. Cicadas screamed from the trees, and inside a small one-story home at the edge of town, Harold Griffin leaned back in his worn leather chair. He was 82, a Korean War veteran, and one who had lived long enough to feel the bitterness of his own years. His living room smelled of cigar smoke, sour whiskey, and old furniture that hadn't been moved in decades. On the walls, black and white photographs of soldiers in uniform hung next to framed medals. To anyone stepping in, the house was a museum of Harold's past glories. But beneath that pride was a man who carried venom in his words. That evening, Harold had invited two of his oldest friends, Frank Malloy and Douglas Carter, for drinks. Both men were veterans too, both silver-haired and stooped with age, and together they carried the swagger of men who still remembered themselves as warriors. Frank poured whiskey into 3 cloudy glasses. "Here's to the old days," he said, his hand shaking slightly as he raised the glass. "The old days," Harold echoed, lifting his drink and downing it in one swallow. They laughed, coughed, slapped the table. But soon, Harold's eyes shifted toward the woman standing silently near the kitchen doorway. Aisha Daniels, 36 years old, Harold's live-in caregiver. A black woman with calm eyes and steady hands. She wore plain scrubs, her hair tied back neatly, and in her hands was a clipboard where she had noted Harold's evening medications. Harold smirked, leaning forward in his chair. "You boys see her standing there, like a shadow, ain't she? Always watching me, always lurking. Can't even take a piss without her knowing." Frank chuckled. Douglas nearly choked on his drink. "I swear," Harold went on, louder this time, "feels just like back in Alabama when I was a boy. Black folks smiling to your face, but cursing you under their breath. I wouldn't trust 'em with a nickel. Hell, if she weren't paid, she'd probably be running off with my silverware." The old men burst into cruel laughter, the kind that left their eyes watering. Harold rocked back in his chair, enjoying his own poison. Aisha didn't answer. She had learned that silence was sometimes the strongest armor. But her jaw tightened, her fingers gripped the clipboard a little firmer. Still, Harold wasn't finished. "She prays every night I just keel over." "Don't you, girl?" he shouted toward her. "That's what you're waiting for, huh? Harold Griffin drops dead, and you dance around the kitchen." The men roared with laughter again, whiskey sloshing in their glasses. Aisha closed her eyes briefly. In her heart, the words stung like daggers, but she held her ground. She had taken this job knowing Harold's reputation in town. He was known for his sharp tongue, his temper, his bitterness toward anyone different from him. Still, she told herself, this was work. She was here to care for him, not to like him. Hours later, when the whiskey bottles were nearly empty and Harold's friends staggered out into the night, the house finally fell silent. Aisha moved through the kitchen, cleaning glasses, straightening the table, setting out Harold's nighttime medicine. She moved with the quiet rhythm of someone who had done this routine countless times before. But as she stood by the counter, she thought back to his words, each insult replayed in her head, the laughter, the mocking eyes, and a question pressed against her chest. How long could she endure it? She exhaled slowly, steadied her breathing, and reminded herself of the oath she had made when she became a nurse. To protect, to serve, no matter who the patient was, even if that patient spit poison at her every single day. And then, just as she set the last glass down, came a sound that cut through the silence of the house. A heavy thud, loud enough to shake her nerves. Her head jerked toward the hallway. Harold's room. Before we dive in deeply, let us know in the comments what country or which city you're watching this story from. We'd love to know how far this story travels. The sound echoed again, another dull thud, then silence. Aisha's heart thumped. She set the glass down carefully, almost afraid of what she would see. Without wasting another second, she hurried down the narrow hallway, her footsteps quick against the wooden floor. Harold's door was half open. She pushed it wider and froze. Harold Griffin, the proud veteran who had spent the evening laughing at her expense, was slumped on the side of his bed. His body was twisted awkwardly, one arm dangling toward the floor, his face drenched in sweat. His skin was pale, lips trembling. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. "Mr. Griffin!" Aisha shouted, rushing forward. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressing a hand against his forehead. The heat coming off his skin shocked her. His eyes rolled weakly, half closed, but he managed to mumble something. It was broken, almost impossible to hear. Aisha. Not mocking this time, not cruel, just weak, helpless. Aisha knew what this was. She had seen it before. The whiskey, the skipped dinner, the stress of the evening. His blood sugar had dropped dangerously low. Her training kicked in, but her emotions battled inside her chest. This was the same man who had humiliated her hours ago, the same man who had spat insults at her since she first took this job. For a split second, she thought about walking away, just for a moment, leaving him to the words he had sown. But her oath, her duty, her humanity, held her firmly in place. "No," she whispered to herself, "not tonight." She grabbed the emergency kit she had placed in his room months ago, always prepared for a crisis like this. She yanked out a small tube of glucose gel. With her other hand, she tilted Harold's head carefully and pressed the gel against his lips. "Come on, Mr. Griffin," she said, her voice steady though her pulse raced. "Stay with me. Don't you dare give up now." Harold groaned faintly. His hand, trembling like a leaf in the wind, reached for her wrist. He held on, not strong but desperate. Aisha squeezed his hand gently, forcing calm into her voice. "You're going to be all right. Just breathe." She watched closely. Seconds dragged like hours. His chest rose slowly, fell shakily, sweat soaked through his undershirt. His face twisted as if every breath was a battle. Aisha grabbed the phone from the bedside table and dialed 911, pressing it to her ear while keeping her other hand on Harold's shoulder. 911, what's your emergency?" A calm female voice answered. "This is Aisha Daniels, caregiver," she said quickly. "My patient, Harold Griffin. He's 82, diabetic. He collapsed. He's sweating, breathing shallow. I've administered glucose gel, but he's still weak. We need paramedics immediately." "Stay with him," the operator instructed. "Paramedics are on their way. Keep him calm. Monitor his breathing. Aisha nodded, even though the operator couldn't see her. She placed the phone on speaker and leaned close to Harold. You hear that? Help is coming. You just hold on. Harold's lips moved again. His voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. Don't. Let. Me. Aisha swallowed hard. I won't. The minutes stretched endlessly. Every sound, the hum of the ceiling fan, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, seemed louder than it should have been. And then in the distance, she heard it. The faint wail of sirens. Growing louder, closer. Red and blue lights flickered through the blinds of Harold's window, splashing across the walls in eerie streaks. Aisha exhaled with relief. She wasn't alone now. The front door burst open, heavy boots pounding against the floor. 2 paramedics rushed in with bags and equipment. Their voices were brisk but steady. Where is he? One asked. Bedroom, Aisha called out, waving them in. They hurried to Harold's side, kneeling down with practiced speed. One checked his vitals, the other set up oxygen. What happened? The first asked. Diabetic, Aisha answered. He'd been drinking, skipped dinner. I gave him glucose gel right away. The paramedic glanced at her, nodding firmly. You did good. If you hadn't acted this fast, he wouldn't have made it. Aisha stepped back, her chest still tight. She let them work, watching as they adjusted his breathing and stabilized his sugar levels. Harold's eyes fluttered weakly open, catching sight of her in the doorway. His gaze lingered. No words this time, just a look. And in that look was something new, something between shame and disbelief. But the night wasn't over yet. The paramedics moved quickly, their voices low but urgent. One slipped an oxygen mask gently over Harold's face while the other prepared an IV. Aisha stood in the corner, arms folded tight against her chest, every muscle in her body wound up. BP is low, one muttered, adjusting the monitor. Get that line started, the other answered, sliding a needle into Harold's thin arm with precision. Harold winced, groaning faintly through the mask. His pale eyes flickered open again, scanning the room. For a second, he seemed confused, unsure if this was reality or some fever dream. Then his gaze fell on Aisha. His grip on the blanket tightened slightly. The paramedics didn't notice. They were focused on keeping him alive. You'll need to come with us to the hospital, one of them finally said, glancing at Aisha. He's stable for now, but this could have gone very differently. Aisha nodded, her throat dry. I'll ride along. I'm his caregiver. The paramedics lifted Harold carefully onto the stretcher. His frail body looked even smaller under the harsh glare of their flashlights. As they strapped him in, Harold's eyes followed Aisha, lingering on her like they had something to say, but no words came. The stretcher rolled down the narrow hall, wheels thumping against the wooden floor. The living room, where hours earlier Harold and his old friends had sat laughing and making cruel jokes, was now silent, empty, almost shameful. The whiskey glasses still sat on the table, their contents untouched since the chaos began. Aisha followed them outside. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the faint smell of pine from the yard. Neighbors had stepped onto their porches, curious about the flashing lights. Some whispered to each other, watching as Harold Griffin, decorated veteran, proud man, loud voice, was wheeled into an ambulance with tubes and wires attached to him. Aisha climbed inside after him, settling on the bench seat against the wall. The paramedic opposite her checked Harold's vitals again. His numbers were climbing slowly, but remained fragile. Harold's eyes fluttered open once more. This time his gaze was steady, locking onto Aisha. The mask muffled his voice, but she heard the faint rasp. "You stayed?" Aisha held his stare. "Of course I did." He tried to speak again, but his throat caught. His eyelids sagged shut. The paramedic adjusted the mask, checking the IV flow. "Don't force him to talk," the medic said softly. "He needs rest." The ride to the hospital was filled with the hum of the engine, the occasional crackle of the radio, and Harold's uneven breaths. Aisha kept her eyes on him the whole time, her mind racing. She remembered the laughter earlier, the sting of the words he and his friends had thrown around so carelessly, and yet here she was, his anchor between life and death. When they arrived, hospital staff met them at the bay doors, whisking Harold inside. Doctors and nurses surrounded him, asking rapid questions, checking charts, hooking up machines. Aisha followed closely until a nurse stopped her at the doorway. "You're his caregiver, right?" the nurse asked gently. "Yes. You can wait out here for now. They'll stabilize him and then let you know when you can see him." Aisha sank into one of the plastic chairs in the waiting area. Her hands trembled slightly as she laced them together. The adrenaline that had carried her through the crisis was wearing off, leaving her body heavy. Minutes passed, then more. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled her nose. The overhead speakers called for doctors and nurses in different wings. Every time a door swung open, she looked up, half expecting bad news. Finally, a doctor approached her, clipboard in hand. "You're Miss Daniels?" "Yes. Mr. Griffin is stable now. His sugar levels were dangerously low, but you acted quickly. You likely saved his life." Aisha nodded, her throat tight. "He's resting," the doctor continued. "You can go in, but don't expect much conversation tonight. He needs to recover." Aisha stood and followed the doctor down the hallway. The beeping of machines grew louder as they neared Harold's room. She pushed the door gently, stepping inside. Harold lay propped against white pillows, his face pale but calmer now. The oxygen mask had been removed, replaced by a nasal cannula. His hands rested weakly on the blanket. When he noticed her, his eyes softened. There was no laughter now, no sneer, no mask of pride, just silence. Aisha pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The hospital room was filled only with the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. For the first time since she had known him, Harold Griffin didn't look like the man who always had something sharp to say. He looked like a man who had been shaken, cracked open by the weight of his own frailty. And Aisha, sitting there quietly, wondered what he was thinking, but she didn't ask. The night still held too much in its grip. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room, slow and methodical, as if it were marking time itself. Harold lay back, his chest rising and falling beneath the thin hospital blanket. His body looked so much smaller without the camouflage of whiskey, bravado, and loud talk. Aisha sat close, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't fidget. She didn't speak. She simply sat there, present, steady, the way she always had. It was Harold who finally broke the silence. His voice was raspy, dry as gravel. "You didn't have to. Do what you did." Aisha's eyes shifted toward him. "I know." "Then why?" He swallowed hard, the effort visible in his throat. His eyes were red-rimmed, searching her face as though he needed an answer he could live with. Aisha leaned forward, her elbows resting gently on her knees. Because it's my job. Because I took an oath to care for people, even when they don't care for me. Harold's gaze faltered, dropping toward the blanket. His fingers twitched slightly, tugging at the seam. I've said things. You've said more than things, Aisha interrupted softly, but firmly. Words don't disappear when they leave your mouth, Mr. Griffin. They land, they cut, they stay. The silence that followed was heavy. The machines hummed quietly. The hallway outside echoed faintly with footsteps and carts rolling by. Harold turned his head slightly toward the window, where the first hints of dawn stretched pale light across the glass. You don't know what it's like, he whispered after a long pause. War changes a man. Coming home, everything felt different. People felt different. I held on to what I knew, what I was taught. Maybe I held on too tight. Aisha didn't answer right away. She watched him, her expression calm but guarded. Then she said, War changes people, yes, but hate, that's a choice. Harold closed his eyes. His chest rose sharply as though he wanted to argue, but no words came. The silence pressed down again. A nurse stepped in quietly, checking the IV and jotting notes onto a chart. She gave Aisha a polite smile before slipping back out. Harold kept his eyes shut, his face turned slightly toward the wall. For a moment, Aisha wondered if he would retreat again behind the same wall of pride and bitterness he always carried. But when his eyes opened, there was something raw in them, something unguarded. My buddies, he said slowly, voice trembling just enough to betray him. They laughed at those jokes because they were supposed to. We used to talk like that when we were kids, when the world was simpler. But last night, when I looked at you standing there, quiet, not saying a word, I felt like I was the one on trial, and the jury was my own conscience. Aisha let out a slow breath. His words weren't an apology, not yet, but they were different. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms lightly. It's not me you answer to, Mr. Griffin. It's yourself. You've lived long enough to know the difference between right and wrong. Harold shifted under the blanket. His eyes watered slightly, though he tried to blink it away. The man who had once barked orders, who had once stood tall in uniform, now looked like a fragile shell of that soldier, broken not only by age and illness, but by truths he had never wanted to face. I should be dead, he muttered, his voice low. If you hadn't. You're alive, Aisha cut in firmly. That's what matters right now. The words hung there, a lifeline and a rebuke all at once. Neither spoke again for a while. The room filled instead with the steady rhythm of the machines, the faint birdsong beginning outside as morning took hold. Aisha eventually rose from her chair. I'll be back later, she said. You need rest, and I need some air. Harold watched her as she walked toward the door. His lips parted, as if he wanted to say something important, something he had never said before. But the words stuck. He shut his mouth again, swallowing them down. When the door clicked shut behind her, Harold lay staring at the ceiling. His hands gripped the blanket tightly, knuckles pale. His mind was a battlefield of memories, regrets, and the bitter taste of shame that no medal or uniform could ever cover. The night had left a mark, and Harold knew it. The hospital corridor was quiet that evening. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above as Aisha returned to Harold's room. She had stepped out for hours, clearing her mind, walking through the nearby park just to breathe. But now, as she pushed open the door, she felt the weight of unfinished business hanging in the air. Harold was awake. He sat propped up against his pillows, a glass of water on the tray beside him. His hands were still frail, his skin paper-thin, but his eyes tracked her the moment she entered. There was no hostility this time, no smirk, just something unreadable, like a man holding a confession at the edge of his lips. Aisha pulled the chair closer and sat. The silence stretched until Harold finally spoke. "I don't know how to say this," he started, his voice hoarse. "I've lived my life with my chest out, never apologizing to anyone, not to my wife, not to my kids, not to the men I served with. But," his throat worked, words catching like stones, "I was wrong about you, about a lot of things." Aisha didn't move. She let him talk. "I made jokes because that's what I knew. That's what my old friends expected. But lying there last night, slipping under, knowing I might not wake up." His voice cracked, and he pressed his lips tightly before continuing. "The only face I saw was yours, and the thought that the last words you'd ever hear from me were insults. It scared me more than dying itself." The room went still. Harold's breathing was uneven, but there was not "wake up." His voice cracked, and he pressed his lips tightly before continuing. "The only face I saw was yours, and the thought that the last words you'd ever hear from me were insults. It scared me more than dying itself." The room went still. Harold's breathing was uneven, but there was no mistaking the sincerity in his words. Aisha leaned back, folding her arms gently. "An apology doesn't erase what was said. You cut deep, Mr. Griffin. Some scars don't fade." He nodded weakly. "I know. I don't expect forgiveness. But I owe you the truth. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you, and that truth will stay with me, for whatever time I've got left." For the first time in days, Aisha softened, her voice lowered. "I didn't save you for gratitude. I saved you because that's who I am, because hate can kill. But kindness—" She paused, her eyes holding his. "Kindness saves." Harold's eyes glistened. He looked away, ashamed. The proud veteran who once barked cruel jokes at the dinner table now sat humbled, his dignity stripped bare by the simple act of mercy from the very woman he mocked. The door opened. A nurse entered quietly, checking his vitals and adjusting his IV. Harold stayed silent, but his gaze never left Aisha. When the nurse left, he cleared his throat. "I don't have much time left, Aisha. My body's wearing down, but I want to spend what's left better than I have. Maybe it's too late, but I want to try." Aisha rose, smoothing the wrinkles from her shirt. She looked down at him, her face calm but resolute. "Then start by meaning it. Live it, not just with me, but with everyone. Words are easy, change is hard." Harold nodded slowly. He knew she was right. The two sat in silence for a long while, neither rushing to fill the air. The beeping monitor kept time, steady and firm, like a reminder that life was still here, pulsing, waiting to be lived differently. Finally, Aisha gathered her things. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, turning toward the door. Before she stepped out, Harold called after her. His voice was weak, but steady. "Thank you, Aisha, not just for saving me, but for not giving up on me." She paused in the doorway, gave him one long look, and then left without another word. Inside the room, Harold lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling, his medals, his war stories, his bravado. All of it felt small now. What lingered instead was the image of the woman who stayed, the woman who saved him despite every reason not to. And for the first time in his long, stubborn life, Harold Griffin felt something he had never let himself feel before. Humility. The end. Please like and subscribe for more rich stories like this. Comment below. Also, if you really loved this video and want to support the channel directly, you can hit that super thanks button below.